I took the phone, and all of a sudden I see this big flash of light come out of the phone and a loud crack. And it hit me in the face, and it was like I'd been kicked by a horse. My mother-in-law is screaming, and she's running down the stairs right at me, and it was like I didn't even exist. I took about 3 steps, and I was confronted with myself on the ground. Oh shit, I'm dead. It was just 1 minute I was in my body, and the next minute I'm standing there looking at it.
My guest today is Tony Cicoria, who had a near death experience. And I'm really excited to hear all about this. So, Tony, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me, Lori. It's a pleasure to
So,
be here.
oh, I'm so glad. I'm really glad to be able to connect with you and, and share your story with this audience. So, I guess the first question I would have for you is what was your life like before you had this near death experience?
Okay. I'm an orthopedic surgeon and involved in research. I was working 12, 14 hours a day. And most of my life really centered around my work and my family. I had 3 little kids at the time. And so I was brought up Catholic, but I was somewhat reserved in my beliefs because I thought there was a lot of I thought that the church really was more trying to control people than to give us enlightenment. So I was not a big fan. I had gone to college at the Citadel, which was a military school in South Carolina. And then I went to graduate school after that, got my PhD in physiology and biophysics, and then went on to medical school. And I felt like orthopedics was my innate vocation because I was one of those kids that always liked to take things apart and put them back together again. And so it seemed like it was something right up my alley. And things really changed for me in 1994. And at the time, my wife's family had 4 or 5 people that had birthdays in the month of August. They would have a communal birthday party so they could get everybody at once, and it was just easier on everyone. So this year, in August of 1994, they rented a pavilion next to what's called Sleepy Hollow Lake in Athens, New York, which is just below Albany, the capital. And we all, my wife and I and 3 kids, went to this pavilion, and it was a 2-story pavilion next to the lake, and absolutely beautiful. And so I had been given the job to run the barbecue. And so I went outside. I'm on the ground floor, and the family's up on the second floor. And there's about 25, 26 people there. Lots of little kids running around. And so I was running the barbecue and I wasn't paying attention to what else was going on. And mid-morning sometime, I thought, geez, I better call my mom and check on her because she wasn't going to be there. And I just wanted, she was elderly and I wanted to make sure she was okay. So I walked around to the front of the building and there was a payphone attached to it. And unbeknownst to me, an ugly storm had blown up over the lake. And I was completely unaware of it because it was beautiful when I first started. And so I went to call my mom. I dialed the number, let it ring 5 or 6 times, and she didn't pick up. So I said, all right, the hell with this. I got to go back to the barbecue. And I took the phone and I was half a foot away from my face. And all of a sudden I see this big flash of light come out of the phone and a loud crack. And it hit me in the face. And it was like I'd been kicked by a horse. It just threw me backwards and then went flying backwards. And then something really strange happened. As I was going backwards, I had the strangest sensation of moving forwards. And I was absolutely confused. And I remember standing there. I'm at the bottom of the stairs that go up to the second floor. And I'm looking at the phone, and the phone is dangling. And I'm aware of every millisecond of what's happened. I saw the lightning, I heard it, I knew I'd been hit, and I knew I'd been thrown back like a rag doll. And it just didn't make any sense to me that now I'm standing here and I'm absolutely bewildered. And my mind is just racing like crazy, and I'm trying to make sense of it. And at that point, my mother-in-law, who's at the top of the stairs, is screaming, and she's running down the stairs right at me. And I'm thinking, okay, this can't be good. And as she got down right in front of me, it was like I didn't even exist. She didn't acknowledge that I was standing there. She just came to the bottom of the stairs and took off to her left. And I thought, I'm going to follow her and see where the hell she's going. And at that point, I took about 3 steps and I was confronted with myself on the ground. And I remember standing there and I'm looking down at myself. And the only thought that came to my head was, oh shit, I'm dead. And I was absolutely dumbfounded because I always thought that there would be something that told you had died. Bells, whistles, anything. But there was absolutely nothing. It was just 1 minute I was in my body, and the next minute I'm standing there looking at it. And as I'm standing there was a lady and her young daughter were standing behind me waiting to use the phone. And it turns out she was a nurse. How fortuitous was that? And so she gets down to start CPR, and I'm standing there and I can hear everybody and I can see them, but nobody can see or hear me. And as I'm sitting there, I'm analyzing all of this. My mind is racing. And I come to the realization that, geez, I'm thinking exactly like I normally would. I'm thinking in the words that I would normally use. And I suddenly realized that whoever I am, I always am. My spirit is who it is and always is. And this carcass that's on the ground is nothing more than a change of clothes. And I was in it, but now I'm not. And so at that point, I couldn't get anybody to acknowledge me. And so I decided, hell, I'm going to go up and check on my family. So I walked over to the stairs and I started going up the stairs. And I got to about the third step and I'm looking down at the stairs at the ground because I don't want to trip and fall on my face, which is always an embarrassing moment. But as I'm looking down, I see that my legs are starting to dissolve. And I thought, whoa, what the hell is going on? And by the time I got to the top of the stairs, I had lost all form. I was just a ball of energy. And the stairs go off to the left, and I went right through the wall. And when I came out on the other side of the wall, I went right over the head of my wife, who was sitting there, and she was painting children's faces. And I made a specific note of what kids were there, what position they were in, how the furniture was arranged. And that would become important later on because we did a few years, I guess it was a few years after that, we did a special on A&E. I survived I think it was called Beyond and Back. I can't remember. In that exercise of filming that, I think it was, can't remember what channel, must have been it was an A&E show, must have been Discovery. At any rate, we talked about the fact that, and there's no way that I could have seen it or known those things because I was down on the floor dead. So now I've passed over her head and I'm going diagonally through the room and I see everybody that's in there. And when I got through, I went through the roof. And when I got to the other side, things really changed because I was suddenly enveloped in this bluish white light that was coming from off to my right someplace. And it was like a river of pure positive energy. There wasn't anything in that except peace and love. And it was just staggering. And I remember standing there and it was like I was in a river of this stuff. And it's taking me someplace. And I'm looking at it and I see the energy and I can actually see the energy lines and it's going through everything. And I could see that energy was what made up everything. And it almost had a sine wave kind of appearance to it. But I realized that everything was made from this. And I remember thinking, this is the God energy. And I can actually see it. And I thought, maybe I can even measure it. My science brain starting to kick in and say, yeah, I can measure this. At that point, it was taking me someplace. And it had speed and direction. I had no idea where I was going, but it was just an incredible feeling. And I remember suddenly I saw a collage of my life. It was just like pictures on a wall. And I wasn't any discussion or in depth. It wasn't anyone that came to explain anything to me. And I'm just floating in this river going someplace. But I was absolutely ecstatic because it was the most unbelievable feeling of peace and love that you could imagine. And I was so excited to be there and going wherever I was going. And then all of a sudden, it was like somebody flipped a switch and bam, I was back in my body. And I was pissed. I really was. I remember thinking, please don't make me do this. I don't want to go back. I want to go wherever I was going. But I quickly came to the realization that that's not my choice. And suddenly I'm back in my body and where the lightning hit me in the face, it was like somebody stuck a hot poker in it. And where it came out my foot, same thing. And I knew I was still unconscious because I couldn't open my eyes and see anything and I couldn't say anything. And it took several minutes before I was able to open my eyes. And the lady who had been doing CPR had stopped and she was just kneeling next to me. And I remember I wanted to say something to her like, thank you for saving my life. But the only thing that came out was, it's okay, I'm a doctor. And she just looked at me and shook her head a little bit and said, you weren't a minute ago. And I thought that was a really dumbass thing to say. So I thought, I'm not thinking very clearly. I'm just going to keep my mouth shut. And at that point, they called the ambulance, they called the police, and I refused to go to the hospital because I know what it's like going to the emergency room. You're going to sit there for 4 hours and somebody's going to tell you that you're alive and go home. I'm like, I can do that. So I had my wife and the family take me home and I called two of my friend physicians, cardiologist and a neurologist, told them what happened. And they had me come right over. And they looked at me and ran some tests and said, you're alive. And be thankful for that. And I'm like, okay. So I was absolutely bewildered. I said, okay, this couldn't have been a random event. And I say that because I started thinking about what's the probability of a lightning strike that has millions of volts, hits the building, loses just enough current so that it doesn't turn me into a French fry when it hits me. And then just in case I got too much, whoever was pulling the strings made sure there was a nurse standing there to do CPR. And this place is in the middle of nowhere. This little pavilion is, and this little community is literally in the woods. And I started adding these things up in my mind, and what's the probability of all these things happening? It's impossible. And so I came to the realization that this was not a random event. This was orchestrated. And then I was just absolutely troubled by what did it mean? Why did it happen? And the only thing that happened to me after that was that I had trouble remembering names of things for about a week. And I could look at you and I know you. I'll be damned if I can find your name. And it's locked in a drawer someplace. And it was like that with people's names and diseases. I knew everything about a disease, but couldn't think of the name of it. And I thought, okay, that's pretty strange. What was I going to do? That lasted for about a week and then was gone. And I remember thinking, okay, I'm back to normal, I think. And at that point, I went back to work and tried to carry on. And it was really a struggle because I wanted to know why. Why did this happen? How did it happen? What did it mean? And there were nobody was giving me a clue. And I remember I thought, I'm not getting any answers. I'm going to try to find somebody that'll give me one. And I went to see a psychic medium, Linda Dickinson, who lived in the next town over. And I thought, I'll try this. And I remember going to her and I sat down in front of her desk and she was quiet for a minute and then she started laughing. And I said, because I had said to her, I want to know why this happened, what it meant. And so she was just sitting there and then she started laughing. And I looked at her and I said, what's so damn funny? I don't think this is funny. And she said, oh my God, I'm not laughing at you. Your spirit guides are laughing. I said, what do they think is so funny? And she said, they're saying that's what it took to get your attention. I'm like, and I said, you mean they couldn't think of anything more creative? They had to hit me with a 2x4? And that was the beginning of it. And then as I said, I went back to work. And about a couple weeks after the lightning event, I started having this incredible sensation to hear classical piano music, which was a big departure for me. I was a kid of the 60s. There was rock and roll, and there really wasn't anything else. My mom had made me take piano lessons when I was 7 for a year, and which I dutifully did under the threat of life and limb. And after that obligatory year, I quit because I had no interest in it. So I never really learned how to play or do anything. But now I've got this incredible desire to hear it. And it was so strong that I actually drove to Albany again, which was an hour from where we lived in Oneonta, New York. And I went to a music store which had classical piano CDs, which in the early 90s was not something you would find out everywhere. And a CD of Vladimir Ashkenazy, who was a famous Russian pianist, just seemed to jump off the shelf into my hands. And it was Ashkenazy playing his favorite Chopin. And I was so taken with it. I listened to it all the time. I made everybody at work listen to it. I made my family listen to it. And I'm sure they were all sick of it, but I was obsessed with it. And within a couple of weeks of that, I realized that it's not going to be enough to listen to this music. I need to learn how to play. And which is difficult since I didn't know how to play and I didn't have a piano either. I, undaunted by that, the next day, one of our babysitters comes by and says, I'm moving and I have this old upright piano that I love. Could I store it in your house for a year? And I'm like, okay, now things are really getting weird. And suddenly there's a piano. So I went out and bought some books. I thought I can try to teach myself how to play. And I went and bought all the sheet music on the CD. There's this magical thinking that I can do this. And what an idiot. Be that as it may, I thought I could do this. So I started trying to teach myself. And as I was working on that, it was probably a month after that. And I have a dream. And in this dream, it was like the dream was like an out of body experience. I'm walking out onto a stage, and on the front of the stage, I'm at the back, and on the front of the stage, I'm giving a concert at a big auditorium. And I'm thinking, okay, this is pretty strange. And when I kept walking toward myself, and as I got closer, I was listening to the music, and the music had a kind of a loud crashing ending, and it woke me up. And I remember sitting up on the edge of the bed, and I looked at the clock, and it's 3:15. And I thought, okay, I'm going to go out to the piano and see if I can plunk out something that I heard. And I went out there, and I had no idea how to write anything down, or I had no idea how to play. So at that point, I said, the hell with this, I'm going back to bed. And I did, and got up at my usual 6 o'clock, 6:30 to go to work. And from that moment on, whenever I went near the piano to start to do a practice, the music from the dream would start playing in my head. It was always the same. And it was almost like a little 2-year-old child. And if I tried to ignore it, it would say, Daddy, Daddy, play with me. I'm like, what are you doing? What do you want? And I learned very quickly, if I didn't do that, it would become invasive. It would actually intrude into the other things that I was trying to do. And I'd hear this music just taking over again. And I'm like, okay, this is obviously an important thing. And because it was so insistent, I really tried to develop some ability, and I started practicing and trying to teach myself. And I picked a couple of pieces from the CD that I was going to learn. And one day I was banging away at the piano, and my daughter's best friend Jackie was over at the house. And her mom came to pick her up, and her mom is an accomplished violinist and professionally trained. And she came in, and she hears me banging on the piano, and she sticks her head in and she goes, what in the world are you doing? And I said, I'm trying to play this piece of music. It's called the Fantasy Impromptu, one of the Chopin pieces. And I can't understand why the hands don't line up. I said, why would somebody write a piece of music like that? And at that point, she just looked at me and said, it's supposed to be like that. It's called a polyrhythm. And I said, what's a polyrhythm? And she said, I'm not going to even attempt to explain this to you. You need to get a teacher. So she gave me the name of Sandy McCain, who was the head of the music department at Hartwick College, which is just down the street from where we lived. And I called Sandy and asked her if she'd try to teach an old dog some new tricks. And she said, bring me some pieces of music that you're currently working on. And essentially it was an audition to see if she would even take me on. And I did. And at the end of that, she said, okay, I'll take you on as a student under one condition. You're not allowed to play any of those things until I tell you can. I'm like, okay. And I said, why? And she said, because you have already developed bad habits. You've already made things difficult for yourself because you don't have an understanding of everything that's involved. And she said, learning how to play piano is a process and you have to start the beginning, which is what we did. 2 hours a week, 5 o'clock in the morning was the only time we had in common, and we started. And so I continued on this, and the music from the dream continued, just undaunted. And as I learned a little bit of music and how it worked, I would try to write down little snippets of what I was hearing, but I really didn't have any understanding of it. And I would write down a measure or two and I would throw it in a drawer thinking, someday I'll come back to this. And I continued on this pathway of trying to learn and trying to understand the music that I was hearing. And so I started taking lessons in 98, and fast forward to 2002, I started going to a piano camp for adults called the Sonata in Bennington, Vermont. And it wasn't until 2006 when things really changed again. And in 2006, I was thinking about going to piano camp, and I couldn't decide if I was going to go. So in February of 06, I went to see my friend Linda, the psychic. And I went in and I sat down, and she jumps up and just unexpectedly and says, please tell me you're going to music camp. And I'm like, I'm undecided. And she said, you have to go. And I said, why? And she said, because you're going to meet someone there that's going to have a huge effect on your life. And I'm like, okay. And she wouldn't tell me what that effect was or anything else, but she was damn sure that I needed to go. And fast forward to May of 2006, I go to piano camp, and things were different this time because the owner was Polly Vanderlind, and her sister was Erica Vanderlind Feidner. And Erica was the #1 salesperson for Steinway in New York. And she was also a concert pianist. But she had just jumped ship from Steinway and went to Bosendorf for pianos. And she brought 5 of these beautiful pianos in for people to play. And we got talking about all this stuff. And I told her about the music that I was hearing, and I remember her talking about the fact that I was playing things that were way above what she would expect me to be able to do with the number of years that I've been playing. And so I had developed some aptitude for it that I didn't quite understand. And as we were talking, at the end of the conversation, and I had told her about the lightning and all that stuff, and she said, there's only one person that can tell this story. And I said, who's that? And she said, Oliver Sacks. And I said, okay, I don't know Oliver, but Oliver I knew was the author of the book Awakenings, and he was a neurologist in New York City. And that's about all I knew. And I thought, that's interesting. And I just went on about my business. And a couple months later, I get a phone call from Oliver Sacks. And apparently she was friends with Oliver and she told him about this whole story. And he calls me up and says, I heard about the story with you and the lightning and the music. And he says, I have a number of people that I'm studying. And I was wondering if I could have you be one of my patients and come down to New York City so I can interview you. And I thought, sure, why not? So in August of 2006, I get down to Oliver's apartment and I get to spend a whole day with Oliver Sacks, which was absolutely breathtaking. What an amazing mind, an amazing man. And we spent literally the entire day talking about all this stuff, what it meant and what he thought happened. And at the end of that meeting, I'm standing in his doorway saying goodnight. And he looks at me with these piercing eyes he had. And he says, the music from the dream went through an awful lot of trouble to get here. The least you can do is write it. And I was so taken with that, I thought, I'm going to do that. And so the drive home was about 4 hours. I had a lot of time to think about it. And when I got home the next day, I thought, okay, I don't have the faintest idea how to write music. And I was learning how to play, but that's a very different animal. And at that point, I went to a store and I bought a computer program called Sibelius. It's like writing music for dummies. And you use an electronic keyboard and you play the music and it gets translated into hard copy right there on your computer. And so that's and the thing that was interesting about it was the music from the dream was always the same. And it was my internal control. So whatever I wrote, if it didn't sound and match what I was hearing, then I was wrong. And I was so consumed by what Oliver had given me as a charge that I spent the next 7 months every single day. And I would work from the time I got home, I would do my 12 hours and then I would be back at the piano. And I would stay at that till midnight, 1 o'clock every night. And I was absolutely consumed by it. And it took me that whole time. And my goal was to play it for my piano camp in May of 2007. And so I finished it in time. I was able to get it written down and I played it for my group and it was well received. And I thought, okay, well, maybe the music will leave me alone. No, fat chance. Um, but while I was at piano camp, I got a call from Oliver. And he says, I was wondering if I could use you in my book that's coming out called Musicophilia, Tales of Music in the Brain. And I thought, sure, I don't have anything to hide. And he said, good, because you're chapter 1 and it's coming out in the New Yorker magazine in July of this year. I'm like, whoa, I wasn't expecting that. But I agreed. And sure enough, the New Yorker magazine came out and the article was a bolt from the blue. Went into great detail about what had happened. And suddenly the phone was ringing off the hook. And one of the first calls I got was from a guy named Carlton Clay. Carlton was the had a music department at State University in New York in Oneonta, which was another college. And Carlton says, I've read the article and I was wondering if you'd come and teach a class. And I thought, wow, that would be interesting. I said, I'll do that. Great. And a few weeks later, he calls again and says, geez, I'm getting an awful lot of calls about this. And he said, would you play the music for the class? And I thought, sure. How bad could that be? And then I went on about my usual routine. And then a month later, he calls and says, geez, he says, I can't understand this. I'm getting absolutely killed with phone calls. People are asking about this, and would you consider doing a concert? And I said, no. I said, I have not the faintest idea how to do something like that. And somehow he talks me into it. And I thought, oh my God, what have I done? And about a month before the concert, which was going to be in January 29 of 2008, which was my birthday. So it was like a rebirth. And Carlton calls again. And he says, you won't believe the amount of people that are calling about this. And he says, I've got 3 television crews that want to record this concert. I'm like, oh my God, you're kidding. And he goes, it's BBC One, Granada Media, and German television. And I thought, oh my God, how am I going to do this? And I've already invested too much time to just back out of it. And so I agreed to do it. And the night of the concert, I remember walking out onto that stage and I thought, turn and run. I also made a point of, when I went to the green room, I remember sitting there saying my prayers, and I said to God or whoever was listening, you went through an awful lot of trouble to get me here. Don't abandon me and embarrass us both. And I made it through the concert and I played. By the time that point came, I had written the piece from the dream, and there were a couple of other pieces that I had written, and I played all 3 at the concert, and then the music took on a life of its own. I was getting asked to play it all over the place, and which I did. And because every time I would play the music someplace, people would come up to me afterwards and they'd get real quiet. They'd lean in and they'd say, something like this happened to me. But they were so afraid to talk about a near-death experience that they didn't talk to anybody about it. This was information that nobody could share. And at the time, it was not something that you talk to people easily about, and was not accepted by the medical community. At that time, if you went to your doctors, they would tell you were crazy or you were having a hallucination. But it wasn't. And I knew for sure that it wasn't, because I was there. I've often thought that the music comes from someplace. It's not like I can sit down and create it myself. It's almost like a channel that is beamed down into my head. And the music comes in block form. It's almost like it's downloaded. And it made me think. I did a lot of reading about other composers, and a lot of the classical pianists composers would talk about this. Mozart was most famous for it, and he would say, the music comes to me in block form. He says, it's completely finished. All I'm doing is writing it down. And Beethoven and Brahms, they all would say similar things. And from my own standpoint, it was very clear to me that when I would tie into that source, there was no way to defend against it. It was coming. And there was always some emotional component related to it, but so I don't understand all of it. But I do think that the music exists somewhere in the quantum ether of what we don't know. And we have very little understanding of how our brain actually works and how memory works and where it's housed. People have done lots of calculations that say that there's no way that our brain could have all of that information stored. It would have to be the size of a building. And so where is it? And I've read lots of speculation that all of that information is stored in the quantum ether, the quantum fabric of the universe. Somehow all of that information, some people call it the Akashic records. It's all out there. But it's all very clear to me that, number one, we are who we always are. Our spirit, we have a duality. We have a spiritual presence and we have a physical presence. The physical dies, but the spiritual presence keeps it going on and goes on forever. So it's been a very enlightening experience, and I'm forever grateful because I think it's the greatest thing that could ever happen to somebody to know that that we don't die. We continue on. We change forms, but we keep going through this process.
Wow. I don't know what's more incredible, Tony, the actual near-death experience or the part with all the music. So I have many questions for you. The first one I want to start with, it was interesting that you had that dream where you saw yourself on a stage and then you saw yourself on the back part of the stage and on the front you were performing. And it seemed like that was a lucid dream. So when it actually happened, did it feel like deja vu to you?
It didn't feel like deja vu. It felt like I was experiencing it in real time. And I've talked to lots of people about all of that. And some people think that it was my higher self connecting with me. But I honestly don't know. But it was very clear that I was given something and I wasn't sure why or what it meant. But over time, I've come to believe that the music affects people. And I've had people that want to come to my house and lay down under the piano so they can feel the vibration. And almost every time I've played in concerts, people come up afterwards and they say, I saw visions, I had these feelings. So there's something about the music that affects people's brains and in ways that I don't understand, and I don't think anyone else does either. But it's really amazing. And what's interesting is that I went from not having this ability to having it. And I got asked to be Daryl Treeford is another physician who's a specialist in savants. And he had asked me to be interviewed as well. And he had a group of people that had unusual events in their lives, either got hit with something, had surgery, had any number of things happen to their brains. And all of them developed some unusual ability that they didn't have before. And so it made me realize that we all have this ability, We just don't know how to access it. Because if it can happen by accident, it can happen willfully. But there's no instruction book.
Of course,
And
of
and
course.
unfortunately.
Let's go back to your near-death experience. So one of the things that you said is very unusual. I've never heard anybody say this before or make this extrapolation, and I thought that this was fascinating. You surmised that because of all of the different synchronicities that happened, the nurse being there, the timing, the storm coming in, how you were hit, how you weren't actually killed, had the near-death experience, that it was beyond statistical significance. And the one thing I want to point out about that is that I was a pharmaceutical sales rep. You're a doctor. One of the things that I know is that you and I were both trained to do something very special that not everybody is trained to do. And that is to read clinical trials to understand the design, how they are put together, and to figure out the p value, statistical significance, right?
Yep.
So I love that you use that skill to assess and determine that this was beyond a statistical significance. And then, in addition to all of that, you had these confirmations through evidential information, meaning that you were able to talk to your wife and say, you were exactly positioned here, you had this child here, this was what was painted on this child's face. Seemingly no way that you could have known all of that because you're laying dead on the ground floor, a story beneath
Yeah.
her. So when you were able to talk to people, how fulfilling was it to get these confirmations?
It's interesting. This was in the early 90s. But in the early 90s, you didn't talk about these things.
True, very true, very
Um,
different times.
it was. And if I went to work and I told other physicians that I'm seeing dead people, they're going to call the state and say, you need to take this guy's license away because he ain't right. And that was a real consideration. So I was very careful about who I said anything to. And unfortunately, I kept it very close to the vest. When it happened, and I told my wife about all this stuff, I don't think she really believed it. And it wasn't until the couple of years later when we did this thing for the A&E and I shared all of that information. I remember her looking at me like, oh my God, I didn't know that you knew all of that. And so I think that was the first time that she really believed that I was telling the truth.
That had to be pretty validating.
Yeah, it really was. And so there's just so many things that just spin around in your head with all this stuff.
Spirit sets you up completely. So, Tony, if people want to connect with your music, how do they find what you do?
It's available. I originally put it out on what's called cdbaby.com, but I know that it's available through Amazon and all of the big music downloading companies, Spotify, etc. So it's out there.
And then you also have a book, correct?
I am writing a book. I have not finished it yet, and I'm hoping that this year I'll get my butt to finish it.
Well, will you come back and talk to us again once you have your book done?
Sure.
Would love that. This has been such an incredible story. I vividly remember your near death experience story that I heard many years ago. It's a pretty impressionable one. And also the parts where you were on the other side with God and having the life review. So I'm going to ask you one more question about it. And that is this life review. So it's interesting because a lot of times when people have a life review, different parts of the life review are pointed out. And you said you didn't really have an entity other than you were in the energy of what was source or God. Can you share a little bit more about anything that you remember from your life review?
I remember seeing all of these pictures on the wall, and it really was a collage of high points, low points, and things that just stood out. but there was no in-depth review or discussion. It was just like, okay, these were things that happened.
Only from your
And
vantage point, though, you didn't experience it from somebody else's vantage point.
no, it was just I was like I was passing through the room.
Tony, having an experience like this, what's the biggest takeaway or the biggest thing that you want everybody watching to know?
I think the biggest thing is that your spirit lives on. There's no such thing as death. And you are who you are always. You know,
Beautiful. I want to thank you so much for
you're
coming
welcome.
on and sharing your story. Thank you for what you're doing to help contribute to the collective consciousness and waking them up. For you, you had to be hit, as you said, with a 2x4, struck by a
Yeah,
bolt of lightning in order for them to get your attention, your darn spirit guides. Hopefully, everybody else watching today doesn't have to go to that extreme because
yeah.
of someone like you sharing a story like this.
Uh, it's absolutely, it's a great experience, and I appreciate the ability to tell you.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for watching.
Thank you.
This channel's for seekers, for hearts who remember there's something more. Subscribe to join the awakening.